So thanks for having me. And I've just enjoyed even just thinking about the theme over the last few weeks. And I thought I'd just start off by saying that one of the things that I've been dipping into in the lockdown is the new edition of the Sutta Nipata, which is handy. Handy is just here. So the old edition of the Sutta Nipata is quite a thin book, but this is a new edition and it's really, really thick. Wow. And it's an edition by Bhikkhu Bodhi. And it's really thick because it contains an introduction from him to every sort of like big set of chapters. And also it contains a little bit of the commentary. And I really, really enjoyed dipping into it because the commentary gives you a bit of background as to where and why the Buddha said what he said, you know, why the Buddha taught what he taught. And basically you get a background story of which disciple at which time was being silly and being told off by the Buddha, basically. This is a little bit of a thing for me. I do really like reading about the original Sangha. You know, I'm very interested in latter Buddhism, but I think the sort of like heart belongs to the kind of original disciples, the original stories. And another reason why I thought I'd give a little presentation on one of the Buddha's particular disciples, Sariputta, is that because he features in latter Buddhism. So there are stories of him that were written after he died, but in those stories, he's kind of like the fall guy. So he's not, you know, he's kind of like portrayed as somebody who's a bit like a stick in the mud, or he doesn't sort of, yeah, he's not treated very nicely, basically, in latter Buddhism. So I thought I'd just sort of, you know, tell the story of the original Sariputta and sort of like cheer for him. Okay, so it's kind of like a little life story of Sariputta, and I'd hopefully draw out various themes of Live United as we go along. So our story begins over 2,500 years ago, possibly a few years before the Buddha was enlightened. And it begins in two little villages, one called Upatisha in northern India, where young Sariputta is born. And he's born to this upper caste Brahmin family. And it so happens that on the very same day in the neighboring village, to some family friends of his parents, another boy is born, and that's Moggallana. So these two boys, they grow up as friends. They're very, very popular, upper caste, possibly like wealthier young men, you know, if you can be wealthy in a northern Indian village in medieval India. And in the commentaries, it said that each of these boys had 500 other young men following them. So basically, they were just quite popular young men. Now, in the area where they lived, every single year, there would be a hilltop festival. So I kind of imagine it to be a little bit like Glastonbury, but without the amplifiers or electricity. And because I'm here with Harsha Prabha and Bodhivangsa, I imagine like some of you were probably at the original, possibly at the original Glastonbury. So there were plays, there were magic shows, there were singers, musicians, you know, all sorts of entertainment that wealthy young men would enjoy. And on the first day, they thoroughly enjoyed themselves. Yeah? So they had a great time. And then on the second day, they did the same thing. So they watched dancing girls, they ate delicious food, they probably flirted outrageously with people who they found attractive. But on the third day, something started to change. So Sariputta sat watching all these shows on his beautiful couch, and it all began to pall, began to feel a bit superficial and a bit pointless. And it might have even crystallized into thoughts like this: why am I doing this? You know, my life is just a cycle of trying to find happiness, watching these shows, enjoying it, doing silly things. It's a bit fleeting. Things start to change, and I need to find all this fun and excitement again. Now, his good friend Moggallana noticed his mood and asked him if he was all right. You know, why was he somber? Why wasn't he laughing? Why wasn't he enjoying himself anymore? And Sariputta told him what his thoughts were, what his feelings were. And Moggallana said, I've been having those very, very same thoughts, those very same feelings. So they talked and they discussed what they would do, and they decided that what home, and rather than seeking their fortune, they would seek a spiritual teacher. So that's what they did for the next few years. You know, they went from teacher to teacher, learning everything they could. And because they were smart and, you know, quite educated young men for their time, they learned everything that these teachers could teach them quite quickly. But they never found a satisfactory answer to their quest, which was really a quest for freedom, a quest for the end of suffering, if you want to use those terms. So they kept on searching, they kept on seeking. Sometimes they do that together, and sometimes they do that alone. And because they were loyal friends, they made a vow that whoever found the right teacher, that person would tell the other. Yeah. So they made a vow to each other. And one day, Sariputta chanced on one of the very, very first disciples of the Buddha, whose name is Assaji. So if you remember the story of the Buddha, there were five disciples, five companions when the Buddha was, well, before he was enlightened, and he was practicing his sort of self-mortification practices. And these companions left him. But after the Buddha got enlightened, he went to find these five companions, and they became his very first disciples. And one of them is this monk, Assaji. And there's a whole story of how Sariputta was really struck by Assaji's composure, his deportment, his demeanor. The story goes on to tell how he questioned Assaji. What is his dharma? Who is his teacher? What dharma does his teacher profess? And it goes on to tell how Assaji told Sariputta a very, very simple verse of the Buddha's teaching, which has since become very famous throughout the Buddhist world. And at the end of that verse, Sariputta gains insight and becomes a stream entrant. I won't go into the story because I want to tell other stories. The main point I want to make is that instead of to see the Buddha, to see this amazing teacher of Assaji's, Sariputta remembers his vow to his good friend Moggallana. So he goes to find Moggallana, and possibly Moggallana is some way away. He goes to find Moggallana before they set off together to see the Buddha. So Sariputta and Moggallana go and see the Buddha, who taught them the Dharma, gave them meditation, set them on their path in training in the Dharma. And in time, they became fully enlightened disciples of the Buddha. In fact, they were very, very good disciples, and the Buddha named them his chief disciples. So in the tradition, every Buddha that comes into being has two chief disciples, and one of them has the wisdom and the intellect that systematizes, analyzes, and categorizes the teaching. And in our Buddha Sasana, in our sort of Buddha dispensation, that's Sariputta. And then the other disciple is one who's greatly endowed with spiritual powers or siddhis, and kind of like slightly magical powers. And that, in our Buddha dispensation, is Moggallana. But there doesn't seem to have been any rivalry between Sariputta or Moggallana. And they remained very, very good friends. They went on teaching tours together. They went on retreats together. One of my favorite suttas at the moment is in the Sutta Nipata, is the Kokalika Sutta. And the background to it is, it sort of starts off with Sariputta and Moggallana going on a little duolatry. It's kind of like solitary, but with a companion retreat with each other. And when there was a schism in the Sangha, the Buddha sent both of them, both Sariputta and Moggallana, together to sort it out. So even though Sariputta was mainly known for his analytical wisdom and his intellect, and he was responsible for codifying the teaching, he wasn't a kind of aloof intellectual type. The stories that come down to Sariputta the man include ones where he's a helper, a generous and warm-hearted and compassionate man, He's a Sangha builder, a community builder. He would often stay back from the alms rounds to tidy after the monks. So, people would sort of go off and beg for food, and they'd sort of leave their monastery in disarray, and Sariputta would be the one sort of picking up after them. When the Buddha and the sort of retinue of monks moved from place to place, even though Sariputta was the chief disciple, he wouldn't be at the head of the retinue. Often he'd sort of stay back and look after the young monks, look after the old monks, look after the sick monks. And often he would even arrive a day late when all the nice lodgings in the new place were already taken. Yeah. But he was also very patient and humble and unresentful. So we have stories of Sariputta forgiving monks who have blackened his name. And one of the verses in the Dhammapada said to have been the Buddha describing Sariputta's quality of not holding grudges. And it goes, unresentful like the earth, firm like a gatepost, equipoised and strong in vows, a mind without impurities is like a pool. For such a one, the rounds of birth exist no more. So, the other thing about Sariputta that I really like is that he was willing to receive corrections from anyone. So one day, in a moment of unmindfulness, his underrobe, which is the equivalent of one's, was showing. And a young novice, just 7 years old, couldn't help himself and pointed it out to Sariputta. And Sariputta is reputed to have stepped aside, rearranged his robe, and then turned to the young novice with his hands in namaste position and said, "Now it is correct, teacher." Isn't that lovely? So despite all his good qualities, people did get jealous of him. Despite the fact that he was enlightened, people would criticize him. And I often find that quite reassuring somehow. But the thing is about Sariputta is that he would not harbor any resentment or ill will to his critics. Okay. So another favorite story about Sariputta is his respect and reverence for Asaji. So Asaji was the monk who first introduced Sariputta to the Buddha. And whenever Sariputta arrived at any place, if the Buddha was there, Sariputta would always go and greet the Buddha first. And then if Asaji was also there, he would go and greet Asaji because Asaji was his first real teacher. And when Asaji was staying in the place, Sariputta would find out where it was and make full-length prostration in that direction. At some point, this led to a misunderstanding, and some monks thought that Sariputta was keeping up even practice of saluting the 4 directions and went to the Buddha to complain about it. You can see like the Buddha had to like give quite a lot of teachings because basically people would come to him and complain about different people. Of course, the Buddha set them straight and told them to emulate Sariputta in paying respects to their teachers. So Sariputta does, in some ways, like he does sound a little bit like an intellectual. He'll always be like asking the Buddha to explain this and then to explain that. And it's kind of a bit of a Dharma geek. But he also had a side where he really revered and respected and loved his teachers, even when his attainments probably had surpassed Asaji's by that point. So Sariputta was a much loved figure in the Sangha. His friendship with Moggallana wasn't an exclusive one. They weren't like a little clique together. He was loved by other monks. He had his own disciples, but also he had sort of Dharma brothers and Dharma sisters. And some of you will know about Ananda, the Buddha's main companion and secretary. And Ananda and Sariputta were particularly good friends. They taught together and they had disciples in common. And there's a particularly moving episode upon Sariputta's death where there's a monk called Chunda who comes and tells Ananda to sort of pass the message on to the Buddha that Sariputta has died. And Ananda sort of hears of Sariputta's death and is grieving and really, really rejoices in Sariputta. So I wasn't sure if I had time for this, but I think I do. So I thought I'd say a little bit more about the death of Sariputta because I do find it particularly moving. It's sweet, you know. So Sariputta, like many of the kind of enlightened disciples of the Buddha, he had a sense of when he was going to die. It seems like quite a few of them did. And towards the end, when Sariputta knew that death was approaching, he wanted to go and return to see his. Now, it doesn't sound like Sariputta and his mother had a good relationship. Shariputta's mother was a wealthy Brahmin woman and who probably thought that her son had given up his position in life to become a wandering monk, little better than a beggar, really, going from door to door, begging for alms food. And she probably sort of thought that he was a bit of a disgrace. In fact, there's a story where on one of his walking tours, Sariputta returns to his home village and he's standing at the door and his mother is following him from house to house, haranguing him. You know, sort of embarrassing him. I can imagine if your mother's telling you off in front of all your disciples, it's not a good look. But Sariputta really wanted to see her before his death. So he goes to the Buddha and tells him what he wants to do and tells him that he wants to return to his home village. And the Buddha knew that it was the last time that he would see Sariputta. And Sariputta saying it would be the last time he would see the Buddha. And Sariputta does this very traditional thing. He asked the Buddha for permission to depart and to die in his hometown. And it's said that Sariputta was asked by the Buddha to give one last Dharma talk to the attendant monks. And then at the end of this talk, Sariputta embraces the Buddha's legs and he puts his head on the Buddha's feet. And he asks the Buddha for forgiveness for any wrong word or misdeed that he's done against the Buddha. And the Buddha is reported to have said, "I forgive you, Sariputta. There is not one single word or deed of yours that has been displeasing to me." And then the Buddha says, "Do now what you think it's time for." I think it's one of the Buddha's catchphrases, "Do now what you think it is time for." He says that to quite a lot of people. And then Sariputta gets up, he circumambulates the Buddha times, and then he walks backwards until the Buddha is completely out of sight. And 500 monks accompany Sariputta to his hometown, and they stay the night, one night only actually, with his mother. At this point, Sariputta gets very, very sick with dysentery. And somehow in the course of the night, him and his mother have a conversation, and his mother has a change of heart. From thinking that her son was a good-for-nothing beggar to becoming a follower, a disciple of his and the Buddha's. Finally, when it's very, very close to his death, Sariputta calls these 500 monks and asks them to help him sit up. And when he sat up, he then asked them for forgiveness. And it's around the full moon night in October that he enters his final meditation and then passes away. So that's a sort of little sketch of the life story of Sariputta. Sariputta from the Pali Canon rather than Sariputta from the Mahayana. So I thought there's sort of a few sort of little themes from the stories that you might have drawn out, or you might be curious about. So one of them is keeping your promises. The way Sariputta kept his promise to Moggallana. There's also this thing of just being helpful and humble, and not be sort of worried about status. You could be the chief disciple, but you're also taking out the trash. Looking out for other people, the people who are less able. Not harboring resentments. Some of the things that people said about Sariputta weren't very nice at all. And they often go and tell the Buddha all these naughty things that Sariputta was doing. But Sariputta never harbored any resentments. And being easy to correct, being easy for people to give feedback to. It sounds like Charyas had like quite a good sense of humor. He was able to sort of laugh at himself. And also revering one's teachers, I think that's a really important thing in the Sangha, you know, being able to look upwards, to look up to our teachers. And then finally, this thing of asking for forgiveness and yeah, not letting any bad relationships hang over, particularly into the next life.